Overthinking is not intelligence turned against itself. It is fear disguised as analysis. The mind loops not because it is curious, but because it is attempting to avoid something it does not yet have the courage to feel. Inner peace is not found by silencing thought, but by understanding why thought refuses to be silent. The psyche becomes noisy when parts of us are ignored, rejected, or denied expression. When the inner world is fragmented, the mind compensates by spinning endlessly, hoping clarity will arrive through force rather than integration. The first step toward peace is recognizing that the mind is not meant to be a place you live in permanently. Thought is a tool, not a home. When you identify completely with every idea, fear, or imagined outcome, you become trapped in a false sense of control. Overthinking is an unconscious attempt to predict life so that uncertainty no longer threatens the ego. But life does not ask to be predicted, it asks to be met. Peace begins when you allow the mind to reveal what it is protecting you from. Behind every obsessive thought is an unacknowledged emotion. Anxiety is often grief that has not been mourned, anger that has not been owned, or desire that has been judged as unacceptable. When these inner figures are exiled, they return as intrusive thoughts. The mind speaks loudly when the soul is unheard. Another source of overthinking is the refusal to accept contradiction within yourself. You wish to be confident yet fear rejection, to be free yet crave security. Instead of allowing these opposites to coexist, the mind tries to resolve them intellectually. But harmony does not come from choosing one side, it comes from holding both without collapsing into either. Inner peace is the capacity to tolerate inner tension without rushing to escape it. Silence is also misunderstood. Many believe peace means emptiness, but true inner stillness is alive, alert, and grounded. It arises when you stop demanding answers from the future and return to the present moment as it is. The body already knows how to be at peace. It is the mind that resists. When attention returns to breath, posture, sensation, and rhythm, thought naturally loosens its grip. Finally, peace requires responsibility for your inner life. Not everything you think is true, and not everything you feel needs to be acted upon. When you stop identifying with every mental movement, you reclaim authority over your consciousness. The mind becomes a servant rather than a tyrant. Overthinking fades not because you defeated it, but because it is no longer needed. Inner peace is not the absence of conflict, it is the integration of it. When you listen inwardly, accept your complexity, and stop fleeing from yourself, the mind rests naturally. And in that resting, clarity appears without effort. Overthinking is often mistaken for depth, intelligence, or careful consideration, but at its core, it is driven by fear rather than wisdom. The mind does not endlessly replay scenarios because it is insightful. It does so because it is trying to prevent pain, rejection, or loss. Fear demands certainty in a world that offers none, and overthinking becomes the mind as an attempt to manufacture safety where none can be guaranteed. Instead of engaging directly with life, the individual retreats into mental loops, believing that enough analysis will eventually eliminate risk. This is not clarity, it is avoidance. When fear governs the psyche, thought becomes compulsive. The mind circles the same questions, not because answers are absent, but because the ego refuses to accept vulnerability. Intelligence moves forward, tests reality, and adapts. Fear, on the other hand, freezes and repeats. Overthinking keeps the person suspended between action and surrender, creating the illusion of progress while preventing actual movement. In this state, thought no longer serves life, it replaces it. Much of this fear originates from the need to control outcomes. The overthinking mind believes that if every possibility is examined, every mistake anticipated, and every reaction predicted, then suffering can be avoided. But life does not unfold according to mental rehearsal. The more the mind attempts to dominate the future, the more anxious it becomes, because uncertainty cannot be conquered by thought. This creates a paradox. The desire for safety produces the very distress it seeks to eliminate. Overthinking also reveals a lack of trust in one's own capacity to respond to life as it happens. Rather than trusting instinct, experience, or inner resilience, the individual relies on endless mental preparation. This is fear masquerading as responsibility. True intelligence recognizes that adaptability arises in the moment, not in advance. The mind that overthinks has forgotten that it has survived uncertainty before and can do so again. Another hidden fear behind overthinking is the fear of feeling. Thoughts multiply to drown out emotions that feel overwhelming or unacceptable. Grief Anger, longing, or shame are translated into mental problems to be solved rather than experiences to be endured. By intellectualizing emotion, the psyche attempts to maintain control, but the cost is inner peace. What is not felt fully cannot dissolve. It lingers as mental noise. Overthinking also protects identity. If action is delayed, failure can be avoided, and self-image remains intact. The mind prefers endless contemplation to the risk of exposure. In this way, fear preserves the ego by sacrificing growth. Intelligence, by contrast, accepts the possibility of error as the price of learning. Fear demands perfection before movement, a condition that is never met. When fear drives thought, the present moment is abandoned. Attention is pulled into imagined futures or reworked pasts, leaving the individual disconnected from what is real and immediate. This disconnection fuels further anxiety, as the grounding influence of direct experience is lost. The mind becomes both the source of the problem and the arena in which it endlessly fights itself. In that moment, thought softens and awareness deepens. Fear loses its grip not through more thinking, but through honesty, presence, and the willingness to live without guarantees. Thought was never meant to define who you are. It was meant to serve you. Yet most people live as though every thought that passes through the mind is a declaration of truth or a reflection of identity. This confusion creates inner chaos. When you identify with thought, you become trapped inside a constantly shifting narrative, pulled by memories, expectations, fears, and imagined futures. The mind becomes a place of residence rather than a workspace, and peace becomes impossible because thought never rests on its own. A tool is something you use when needed and put down when its purpose is fulfilled. Thought in its proper role helps you plan, understand, communicate, and solve practical problems. But when thought becomes identity, it operates continuously, even when no problem exists. The mind begins to comment on everything, judge everything, and anticipate everything. Instead of being guided by awareness, you are carried by momentum. This is not consciousness, it is automation. Identifying with thought means mistaking mental activity for the self. A single anxious idea becomes, I am anxious. A critical inner voice becomes, this is who I am. Over time, the mind constructs a rigid story about the self, reinforced by repetition. But thoughts are transient. They arise, change, contradict one another, and dissolve. To anchor identity to something so unstable is to live in constant psychological insecurity. The self then feels threatened by every unwanted thought, as if identity itself were under attack. When thought is mistaken for identity, resistance increases. You try to suppress certain thoughts, fight others, and cling to those that make you feel safe or superior. This struggle intensifies mental noise. A tool that is resisted or overused malfunctions. Thought becomes sharp, invasive, and exhausting, not because it is harmful, but because it is being asked to perform a role it was never designed for. Awareness, not thought, is the ground of identity. There's something in you that notices thoughts without being them. The moment you observe a thought, it loses its authority to define you. This observing presence is stable, quiet, and unchanged by the content of the mind. When identity shifts from thought to awareness, thoughts regain their proper function. They become options rather than commands. This shift does not require stopping thought, which is never possible nor desirable. It requires learning when to engage and when to disengage. When you recognize thought as a tool, you no longer feel compelled to follow every mental suggestion. You can allow a thought to pass without agreement or resistance. In this space, clarity emerges naturally and decisions are made with less strain. Much suffering arises not from circumstances, but from identification with mental interpretations of those circumstances. When thought says, this defines me, suffering intensifies. When thought is seen as commentary rather than truth, experience becomes lighter. Life is met directly rather than filtered through endless analysis. When you stop living inside your thoughts, you return to immediacy, sensation, presence, and action. Thought still appears when needed, but it no longer dominates consciousness. In reclaiming thought as a tool rather than an identity, you recover inner space, psychological flexibility, and a quiet confidence rooted not in what you think, but in what you are aware of. The mind becomes loud when the emotional world is ignored. What is often experienced as racing thoughts, obsessive thinking, or inner restlessness is rarely a problem of cognition. It is the echo of emotions that were never allowed to be felt. When feelings are suppressed, postponed, or judged as unacceptable, they do not disappear. They retreat into the unconscious and return in distorted forms, most commonly as mental noise. The psyche always seeks balance, and what is denied expression in one form will demand it in another. Emotions are movements of energy meant to pass through awareness, not obstacles to be avoided. When sadness is not grieved, it transforms into rumination. When anger is not acknowledged, it becomes irritability or relentless inner criticism. When fear is not faced directly, it multiplies into hypothetical futures and catastrophic thinking. The mind takes over because the emotional channel has been blocked. Thought then attempts to manage what feeling was meant to process. Many people were conditioned early to believe that certain emotions were dangerous, weak, or unacceptable. As a result, the psyche learned to translate emotion into thought as a survival strategy. Thinking felt safer than feeling. But this adaptation, useful at one time, becomes a source of suffering later. The mind cannot resolve emotional material through analysis alone. No amount of reasoning can substitute for the simple act of allowing an emotion to be felt without resistance. Mental noise thrives on avoidance. The more an emotion is resisted, the more persistent the thoughts become. This creates the illusion that the problem is intellectual, when in reality the mind is circling around an emotional core it is unwilling to touch. Overthinking becomes a distraction, a way to stay busy, while avoiding vulnerability. The psyche would rather exhaust itself than feel what it believes might overwhelm it. Unfelt emotions also fragment attention. Instead of being present, awareness is pulled into loops, fantasies, and worries. The body holds the emotional charge, while the mind attempts to outrun it. This disconnection between body and mind creates tension, fatigue, and a sense of inner disorder. The individual may feel constantly on edge without knowing why. The noise is not random, it is meaningful communication from within. When emotions are allowed into awareness, something unexpected happens, the mind quiets. Feeling fully requires presence, and presence interrupts compulsive thinking. An emotion that is met without judgment begins to move, soften, and eventually release. The mind no longer needs to shout to be heard. Silence emerges not through control, but through listening. This process does not mean indulging emotion or acting it out. It means acknowledging its existence without interpretation or escape. To feel is not to lose control, it is to restore it. Emotional honesty reduces mental clutter because the psyche no longer needs to compensate. Mental clarity is not achieved by suppressing inner life, but by welcoming it. When emotions are given permission to exist, the mind is relieved of its burden. Thoughts become fewer, clearer, and more purposeful. Inner quiet is not something imposed from above. It arises naturally when nothing within is being pushed away. Inner conflict is not a flaw in the psyche. It is evidence of complexity. The human mind is not designed to be singular, consistent, or perfectly aligned. Within every person lie opposing impulses, values, desires, and fears. One part seeks safety while another longs for freedom. One wants belonging, another demands independence. Conflict arises not because something has gone wrong, but because these parts are alive and active. The problem begins when the mind tries to eliminate one side in favor of the other. Most people approach inner conflict as something to be solved, believing that peace will come once a final decision is made and one voice is silenced. This approach creates further fragmentation. When a part of the self is rejected, it does not disappear, it becomes unconscious and returns in distorted form. Self-sabotage, anxiety, resentment, or sudden emotional reactions that feel out of proportion. The psyche resists internal tyranny just as strongly as it resists external control. Resolution implies victory. Integration implies relationship. To integrate inner conflict means to allow opposing forces to exist in dialogue rather than competition. It requires recognizing that each side, no matter how uncomfortable, carries information necessary for wholeness. Fear often contains wisdom about limits. Desire carries information about growth. Suppressing either leads to imbalance. Peace does not come from choosing one voice over another, but from understanding what each is trying to protect or express. The urge to resolve inner conflict often comes from intolerance of tension. Modern conditioning teaches that discomfort is a problem to be fixed quickly. But psychological maturity is the ability to hold tension without collapse. When opposing impulses are held consciously, a third position emerges, one that is not a compromise, but a deeper understanding that includes both. This new orientation cannot be forced by logic. It arises organically through sustained awareness. Inner conflict also reveals identity attachment. When a person believes they must be one thing and not another, any opposing impulse feels threatening. The mind rushes to defend a fixed self-image. Integration loosens this rigidity. It allows identity to become flexible rather than defensive. The self becomes a living process rather than a static definition. Avoiding inner conflict leads to chronic dissatisfaction. A person may choose stability and later feel empty, or pursue freedom and later feel ungrounded. These are not mistakes, they are messages from the parts that were excluded. Retroactively is far more painful than listening in the moment. Integration reduces this cost by honoring inner diversity before it erupts as crisis. When inner conflict is met with curiosity instead of judgment, the nervous system settles. There is no longer a need for constant self-monitoring or internal argument. Energy once spent on suppression becomes available for creativity, presence, and meaningful action. The psyche feels less divided, not because conflict vanished, but because it was welcomed. Wholeness is not the absence of contradiction, it is the capacity to live with it consciously. When inner conflict is integrated rather than resolved, the individual moves from inner warfare to inner cooperation, and from that cooperation, a quieter, more grounded sense of peace naturally unfolds. The mind becomes restless when it loses contact with the body. Much of what is experienced as anxiety, overthinking, or inner agitation is not caused by external circumstances, but by attention being trapped in abstraction. Thought drifts into memory and anticipation, replaying what has already happened or rehearsing what might occur. The body, however, exists only in the present. When awareness returns to bodily sensation, the mind is gently pulled out of imagined time and anchored in what is real. The body does not argue, interpret, or speculate. It communicates through sensation, rhythm, and impulse. Breath rises and falls, muscles tense and release. The heart responds to experience before words appear. These processes happen without effort or intention. When attention rests in the body, the nervous system receives a signal of safety. The mind quiets not because it has been forced into silence, but because it no longer needs to remain vigilant. Many people attempt to find peace through mental strategies alone, trying to think their way into calm. This often fails because the mind cannot regulate itself in isolation. It requires feedback from the body. When the body is ignored, stress accumulates. Shallow breathing, rigid posture, and suppressed movement reinforce inner tension. The mind then interprets this tension as a problem, generating more thought in an attempt to fix it, creating a self-perpetuating loop. Returning to the body interrupts this cycle. Awareness of breath slows mental momentum. Attention to posture restores a sense of groundedness. Feeling the contact between the body and the ground provides immediate orientation. These are not techniques imposed from outside. They are acts of remembering what is already present. The body has always known how to settle. The mind simply forgot where to look. The body also stores emotional experience. Feelings that were never fully processed remain as patterns of tension, contraction, or numbness. When attention reconnects with the body, these patterns become available to awareness. This does not increase distress, it reduces it. Sensation is honest and immediate. Unlike thought, it does not exaggerate or dramatize. By feeling what is actually happening in the body, emotional energy is allowed to move rather than stagnate. Peace is not something added to experience, it is revealed when resistance drops. The body naturally moves toward equilibrium when it is allowed to function without interference. Slowing down, breathing deeply, and noticing sensation are not escapes from life, but entrances into it. The more consistently awareness inhabits the body, the less the mind feels compelled to dominate experience. When the mind is anchored in the body, attention becomes stable. External events lose their power to destabilize the inner state so easily. The individual responds rather than reacts. There is a sense of being here rather than lost elsewhere. This presence is not passive. It is alert, grounded, and resilient. The body is not an obstacle to peace. It is its doorway. When awareness descends from abstraction into sensation, the mind rests naturally. Stillness emerges not from control, but from contact. In learning to live from the body rather than above it, Inner peace becomes a lived experience rather than an idea. Calm does not arise from controlling the world or eliminating uncertainty. It arises from taking responsibility for one's inner life. Most inner turmoil is not caused by events themselves, but by unconscious identification with every thought, impulse, and emotional reaction that appears in the mind. When consciousness is left unattended, it fills with noise, contradiction, and reactivity. Responsibility begins the moment a person recognizes that not everything occurring in the mind deserves agreement, belief, or action. To take responsibility for consciousness is to acknowledge authorship without self-blame. Thoughts arise, emotions surge, and impulses appear, but awareness chooses how to relate to them. Without this choice, the mind becomes a battleground of automatic reactions. Calm is impossible when attention is constantly hijacked by inner movements that go unquestioned. Responsibility restores a sense of agency, not by suppressing mental activity, but by placing it in context. Many people unconsciously expect their inner state to be dictated by circumstances. If events go well, they feel at ease. If not, they become agitated. This dependence creates fragility. Responsibility for consciousness breaks this pattern by shifting focus inward. External conditions may still affect mood, but they no longer dominate it completely. The individual learns to observe reactions as internal phenomena rather than external commands. Avoiding responsibility often takes the form of justification. I feel this way because of them. I can tell thinking this. These statements relieve immediate discomfort but reinforce helplessness. Calm requires the opposite movement, the willingness to see inner reactions as one's own. This does not mean approving of every thought or feeling. It means acknowledging their presence without surrendering authority to them. When responsibility is absent, the mind seeks distraction, blame, or numbing. These strategies offer temporary relief, but increase inner disorder over time. The psyche senses this lack of inner leadership and compensates with anxiety and vigilance. Calm returns when awareness steps forward as a stabilizing force. Attention becomes less scattered, more intentional. Thoughts slow because they are no longer competing for control. Responsibility for consciousness also involves discernment. Not every thought is useful. Not every feeling requires immediate expression. Choosing where to place attention is an act of psychological maturity. When attention is directed deliberately toward breath, sensation, or purposeful thought, the nervous system responds with regulation. Calm follows clarity, not avoidance. This responsibility is not rigid self-control. It is a flexible, attentive presence that notices when the mind drifts into fear or compulsion and gently returns it. The tone is firm but non-violent. Inner calm cannot be forced. It emerges when chaos is no longer indulged. As responsibility becomes habitual, inner space expands. There is less urgency, less internal pressure to react or explain. Experience unfolds with more ease because awareness is no longer fragmented. Calm becomes stable, not because life is predictable, but because consciousness is tended. In assuming responsibility for the inner world, the individual stops waiting for peace to arrive from outside. Calm is recognized as something cultivated through awareness, choice, and ongoing attention. In this recognition, the mind settles, and a quieter, more grounded way of being takes root. Peace is not something you chase, achieve, or force into existence. It is what remains when you stop fighting yourself. When fear is seen for what it is, thought returns to its proper role. When emotions are allowed to be felt, the mind no longer needs to shout. When inner conflict is welcomed instead of erased, the psyche moves toward wholeness. When attention returns to the body, the present moment becomes stable. And when responsibility for consciousness is accepted, calm stops depending on circumstances. Nothing in you needs to be fixed, only understood. The noise fades not because life becomes simpler, but because you become more honest with yourself. Inner peace is not the absence of movement. It is the quiet confidence that you can meet whatever rises without losing yourself. And in that meeting, the mind rests, the body settles, and life is lived with clarity rather than fear.